One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared.
The treasurer.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. A banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this episode we bring you a conversation from our webinar series with Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, Chris Bowen. He was in conversation with Richie Merzian, Director of the Australia Institute's Climate and Energy Program. And this was recorded live on the 14th of April 2021, and things may have changed since recording.
Thanks, Ebony, and good morning to everyone who has joined us here on the call, and good afternoon as well if you're joining us from further afield. Today, we have the opportunity to dive deep into the climate and energy space, and it seems like a timely occasion to do so. Next week, President Biden will host his Climate Leaders Summit. Now, that'll be the first occasion for the United States to take a forward-leaning public position on where it will take its climate targets and its climate policies. That will be an exciting opportunity for the world to hear from the second largest emitter, but also to see how that impacts other major emitters as well. So alongside President Biden, on Earth Day, the 22nd of April, he has invited 39 other world leaders. That includes Prime Minister Scott Morrison. Australia is invited by virtue of the size of its emissions, not by the quality of its climate policies, because it is a top 20 greenhouse gas emitter. And the format for the meeting will follow a format that President Obama started a while ago, the Major Economies Forum, or what we used to call the Major Emitters Forum, where the largest emitters in the world, they represent the majority of global emissions, all meet and discuss key climate diplomatic policies ahead of the big UN climate summit.
Australia is already dealing with the impacts of climate change here and now. And there's huge international pressure coming to bear on the government. But basically, since the coalition abolished the Gillard government's carbon price, which really effectively reduced emissions while both jobs and the economy grew, the coalition government has really not had a climate change policy. And of course, as Australia heads towards the next federal election, many are really keen to hear Labor's vision for achieving a safe climate if it's elected. So to that end, I am delighted to welcome Chris Bowen, the Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy and the member for McMahon. He's new to this role as Shadow Minister, but climate change and energy is obviously not an issue that he's stranger to. Welcome, Chris Bowen. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thanks very much. And again, apologies for the technical issues when we were starting. But I want to let you know that I'm joining you from my electorate office, which is on the Gabrogal land of the Darug people, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and thank them for their stewardship of this land over the millennia. Thanks to you, to the Australia Institute, for inviting me to participate in this webinar, which I see as a very important opportunity. And thanks to Ben and Richie and all of you for the very strong contribution you make to the climate change debate in Australia. Today, I really want to leave you with two key messages which inform my approach as Shadow Minister for Climate Change and Energy, and inform the approach that Labor will take to climate change policy in the lead up to the next election. Firstly, while the moral case for action on climate change is very strong, winning the domestic argument is key in relation to jobs. And we have to win the argument that good climate policy is good jobs policy. And secondly, while our opponents claim that dealing with climate change is somehow not standing up for our national interest against negative globalism, so-called negative globalism, in fact, this approach is a sellout of our national interest. Now, the US climate change will be held this time next week, and it's an important stepping stone to COP26 in November. And Australia is already under pressure from our most important ally to show along the commitment. Now, political opponents like to pretend that somehow this international situation and pressure doesn't apply to us, that what's happening overseas doesn't affect Australian jobs. But of course, in these coming weeks, that's just a reminder that we will need to point to the need for Australia to do its bit in the international context. and important to point to the economic cost to Australia of being left behind as we are currently being. Australia is now operating and trading in a mid-century net zero environment with over 120 countries and 70% of our trading partners committed. That is just a fact. Australia, as you know, is the only developed country in the world not committed to net zero by 2050. I should say more accurately, we're the only country with a government not committed to net zero by 2050. States and territories are, our local government is, the business community is. All we're lacking is national leadership from the very people meant to provide it. So decarbonisation has begun at the hands of global capital and our trading partners. Now we can allow workers and communities to be decimated as that ramps up over future decades with no policy framework here. That's the government's approach. Or we can recognise that the globe's climate emergency is Australia's jobs opportunity. Now, as you know, Deloitte estimates that over 250,000 Australian jobs can be created. In my view, the jobs opportunity as we in the world move to net zero is really three-pronged: energy generation, resources, and manufacturing. And again, our opponents like to paint good climate change policy as some sort of austerity measure. They paint it as a picture of a trade-off between climate action and economic growth. Nothing could be further from the truth. I believe passionately in economic growth. It lifts people out of poverty. It turns aspiration into reality. We don't need less economic growth. We need more. What we do need to do is cut the cord between economic growth and emissions as we decarbonise our economy. We're going to need to generate a lot more electricity, not less. We need to electrify our passenger transport and basically anything else capable of sensibly being transferred to electric power. As we move our electricity generation to renewables, there's a massive task to create that electricity, store it, and transmit it to where it's needed through very significant upgrades in the electricity grid. And the good news is that the very areas that have provided Australia with cheap, reliable energy are the same regions that are best placed to capitalise on the need for more electricity. These are the areas with the access to the ports, the railway lines and the pipelines, the infrastructure, the space necessary for renewable energy generation. These are central and North Queensland, the Illawarra, the Hunter, the Latrobe Valley, Collibumbury and Whyalla. And just as Australia currently exports materials for energy generation, with the right policy settings, we'll be exporting clean energy. You know, we have 58 million petajoules of solar radiation beaming down on us every year, 10,000 tonnes more than our total energy generation, and some of the best wind resources in the world. The Sun Cable project in the Northern Territory and the Asian Renewable Energy Hub in Western Australia are just two excellent examples of the opportunities for renewable energy export. Germany, Japan, South Korea and other countries are already expressing great interest in the potential for Australian renewable energy stored through hydrogen. Of course, sceptics and opponents think they're clever in pointing out that wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. And of course, renewable energy does need to be stored. But again, the need to expand our storage and transmission represents jobs opportunities. Take batteries. Australia produces 9 out of the 10 minerals necessary to make lithium-ion batteries. And we're the world's largest exporter of lithium. But we're not producing batteries anywhere near as much in Australia as we can and should do. This is a great opportunity. What we need to do is take that raw material, that great advantage that we have, and turn it into value adding. We can do that. We have the resources to do it. What we're not doing is seeing that transition. Now, we have a number of plans to help that become the case. We announced a couple of weeks ago our manufacturing fund, our jobs fund, co-investment with renewable energy manufacturing as one of the key priority areas. What we can't do is just extract those minerals and see it exported without value adding. We've also announced our community batteries plan and our electric vehicles plan. All these are plans which reduce emissions and with the right policy settings create jobs, as well as our Rewiring the Nation policy, another vital step as we partner with the private sector to upgrade the grid and get renewable energy where we need it, creating jobs in the process. Rewiring the Nation is crucial for our economy to broaden access to affordable renewable energy and households and reduce energy costs for business. And we've just announced a $200 million investment in 400 community batteries that I mentioned just before around the country, as well as providing tax cuts to incentivise electric vehicles and the commitment to develop Australia's first electric vehicle strategy. These are our first commitments, but of course they won't be our last. These are just a fraction of the economic opportunities. And I'll just talk quickly about some of the economic risks as well. The Climate Summit next week will reiterate the global imperatives for action on climate change. Scott Morrison has said he won't be dictated to by other countries. Michael McCormack has said that he's not worried about something that might happen in 30 years' time. Now, to me, that comment sums up the unspeakable negligence of the Morrison government, not thinking about the implications of the policies in 30 years' time. This is abhorrent. Their policy of inaction is consigning Australians to the risks and shoals of the international economy decarbonising with no proactive plan from the government to help communities and families impacted by that decarbonisation. Morrison talks of negative globalism, but it's hard to think of anything more negative than destructive negligence, which is his policy. And climate change is at the top of the diplomatic agenda for many of our key allies in Asia and Europe, as well as in the US and UK. They're not only allies, but large export markets for Australia. Now, I'd like to see climate change much higher on our diplomatic agenda as well, but we won't be able to do so unless we get our domestic policy house in order. There'd be no point in doing this because we come to the diplomatic table with very little credibility indeed. But despite the Deputy Prime Minister not caring about what happens in 30 years' time, the economic cost of inaction is real, both in the short term and the longer term. We know that the European Parliament is developing a carbon border adjustment mechanism to start in the next 2 years, and that'll impact on Australian exports and Australian jobs. That's not to mention the immense risk of unchecked climate change itself on Australia. Deloitte pegs this at nearly 900,000 jobs and a $3.4 trillion hit to the economy over coming decades. So yes, acting on climate change is imperative in the global interest. That's important, and we'll hear a lot about that in coming weeks. But because it's in the global interest does not mean it's not necessarily in our own. We need to defend against that fallacy. Getting the energy policy right and acting on climate change is squarely in our national interest. And pretending it's not will put a handbrake on our economy and cost Australian jobs. Now, part of my job will be ensuring that it's in the interest of our regions as well. More jobs and new industries in the regions that have helped build Australia. We owe it to those regions. We can't do it without them. These economic opportunities I've talked about won't just happen by accident. We need a jobs-focused climate and energy agenda. We need consistent national energy policy framework that lowers emissions and doesn't scare off private investment. We need a Labor government to ensure that workers don't get left behind. And we need a government that can deliver on what it promises. That's interested in the outcomes now and in the future, not glib announcements and spin, which is rarely accompanied by delivery. And that government will be an Albanese Labor government. So thanks again for the opportunity today. I'm really looking forward to taking some questions. And again, apologies for the technical issue as we started.
Thanks. We really appreciate you joining us through all the technical difficulties. I know how rough that can be. And we've got about 760 people on the line with us today. But Richie, I'll go to you for the first question and we'll come very shortly to questions from the audience. Thanks, Richie.
I guess front of mind for everyone this week following the Four Corners on Monday is this gas-fired recovery plan that the federal government is still championing. This is to basically invest in new gas basins, new gas power stations, to use gas as the main driving force for our economic recovery. But at the same time, we seem to be recovering, and that's without gas. And when we look closely at this plan, which we've done at the Australian Institute in our submission to the gas-fired recovery last month, there's no report, there's no criteria for how funding will be delivered. There seems to be very little under the hood. What do you think we need a gas-fired recovery, and how do you respond to this push by the government?
Well, it's a fraud. It's a slogan. It's not a policy. It's simply a fraud. There's not been one job created, and there won't be a job created out of this alleged gas-fired recovery. Now, my view about gas is this, and not everybody necessarily will agree with this. Gas will continue to play a role in firming and peaking our grid as we transition to renewable energy. We need to massively increase the storage in our grid through batteries, pumped hydro and hydrogen, which at various levels of development. But that's going to take time. And there's varying views around about how long that will take, or indeed what role gas will play as we do that. But that is the role of gas. That is the principle. It's to peak and firm the market as we transition to more renewables and as we get more storage up and running. It's just a fallacy. It's a slogan in search of a policy. There is no policy underpinning it. Now, in relation to publicly funded gas, again, the problem is even if you did believe in a gas-fired recovery, every time the government talks about public funding of gas, they turn off private investors. Now, this is a complete fallacy. It's an excuse for inaction. They've known Liddell was closing since 2015. They're still talking about gas-fired power stations to replace Liddell, which has been scheduled for closure since 2015. This is all just an excuse for inaction.
Mm. I mean, on that, we might be even expecting later this month for the federal government through Snowy Hydro to be announcing public funding for new gas-fired power stations, which doesn't seem to work with what you've just said. But is there ever an occasion for the federal government to subsidise gas power stations or opening up new gas basins?
Well, I'd need to be very convinced about the case for public subsidies. Public subsidies are really where the market has failed and where it's absolutely necessary to assist the transition towards renewables. And again, as I said, if the government really believed in investing in gas, they'd get out of the way and let the private sector get on with it. But you can imagine if you're on the board of an energy company, and every time you think about investing in gas, and the government says, we might invest in gas too, that's just a chill to investment. So on multiple levels, their policy makes no sense.
Mm. Moving on to electric vehicles, which you mentioned in your opening remarks, Chris. When it comes to transport, it's the one sector that has just increased the most of any in the last 3 decades since we signed up to the UN Convention on Climate. The majority of that is light vehicles, and yet we're probably the back of the pack in the OECD when it comes to zero emissions uptake in Australia. Labor just announced initial policies to assist in lowering that sticker price. We know lowering the sticker price of EVs is the number one way to get them in the hands of everyday Australians. What more can we expect to help bring about this transition?
Yeah, thanks, Richie. And yes, that is an important announcement on our behalf to reduce the sticker price, as you say. It has two mechanisms for those who didn't follow the detailed announcement: reducing or abolishing the tariff on electric vehicles below the luxury car tax threshold, around 77,000. So abolishing the tariff on EVs, plug-in hybrids and hydrogen cars, and also providing the same fringe benefits tax concession that companies get for providing a ute or a panel van to their workers, providing that to EVs. Now, you put those two things together, that's a powerful driver. The tariff really for consumer purchases, and the FBT for fleet purchases, which is half our purchases. And the FBT concession can make a difference of many thousands of dollars for companies deciding what cars to buy their staff. And that will help drive the market. Now, that's our cost offering, but I'm very clear in recognising that that's not enough. There are other elements that we are considering. Really, if you look at the three, I think, handbrakes on EVs in Australia are the cost, range anxiety, and then encouraging manufacturers to take Australia seriously. They're the three challenges that we have. The announcements we've made deal with cost. I have announced also we will have an electric vehicle strategy of which those two cost offerings will be part, but there's more to come when it comes to electric vehicle strategy for us to announce.
I might just follow up on that if I can. We've seen in places like the ACT really good policies to encourage the uptake of EVs, but in Victoria, the State Treasurer is proposing a tax just on electric vehicles, which would be, I think, a world first, correct me if I'm wrong, and seems to go counter to that real drive to try and accelerate uptake. Why do you think there's such a split between state and territory governments and the federal level, and what else can we be doing to kind of promote that uptake?
Well, look, I understand. I'm going to just say I understand where state treasurers, and not just Victoria, others have started to move down this road, are concerned because they're concerned about the eventual diminution of revenue to governments broadly, including the federal government, from petrol tax, and that needs to be considered. It would be better if that was considered, in my view, in a holistic national fashion. But really, every government's got to do their job. And the federal government, I see our job as reducing the sticker price of EVs. As you said, Richie, we are way behind the pack, 0.7% of sales, compared not only to world's best practice, but compared to average, way behind the pack. In my experience, consumers are up for electric vehicles, or at least considering them, if they can overcome those obstacles, including the upfront sticker price, because electric vehicles are more expensive upfront. This will help. This will help with that. Of course, as we know, the cost of electric vehicles will come down over time and eventually reach parity with internal combustion engines, just as the cost of solar panels has fallen 90%. I think we can expect reductions in the cost of electric vehicles costs, but we need to help that process. We need to get the critical mass, because once there's a critical mass of electric vehicles in Australia, then the range anxiety sort of the market responds to that as well, and people just see electric vehicles around them all the time, and they become a lot more acceptable.
We've probably got time for just 2 more questions. So, Richie, I'll go to you, and then I've got one question before we get to questions from the audience.
Sure. Well, definitely keen to jump into the international side of things, Chris. As you mentioned, next week is a big deal. You have, the US, which really does carry a lot of moral as well as economic weight when it takes a big position, and its big position on climate is reversing a trend that it had, and will hopefully have an impact on reversing trends elsewhere as well. The focus from the Special Envoy, John Kerry, has been on the next 10 years, saying, we can't be willy-nilly with what we do in the next 10, because that will ultimately set the pathway for the next 30. And if you look at where the science is going, the urgency just increases every year, especially with the reports around where we are at with 1.5 degrees of global warming recently. And so if the US is going to be pushing forward with, say, anything, close to 50% emissions reductions, halving its emission reductions by 2030, Australia's current target is 26%. It should be doing more. That would be the fair thing to do. That's aligned with what all the research we've done, others have done. What pressure can we expect from a Labor government for the Australian government to be doing more in the short term?
Well, I do think whatever we see from President Biden next week will be important in the international debate, including the Australian domestic political debate, and I'll be participating in that. And I'll be pointing out, that Australia is missing out, as I said in my opening remarks, not only on our international obligations, but on the opportunities, the economic opportunities that go with that. Now, in terms of the pressure Labor will apply and the approach that we will take, as you know, we're committed to net zero by 2050. That shouldn't be remarkable. It should be the basis, but the basic starting point. But alas, it is a point of significant difference between us and the government, that we are committed and they are not. But I'd say this, I agree with you. You can't just have net zero by 2050 without a strong roadmap to get there. And you can't start that in 2048. It's got to start now. And indeed, we have had a lost decade in the Australian context of action on climate change since 2013 in particular. And also around the world, it's been stop-start, particularly with the last 4 years of the Trump administration. So the best time to start with action on climate change was 30 years ago. The second best time is today. And, we will need a strong roadmap to 2050. And what I'll be outlining is that roadmap to get there, including updates at various points about what we expect for emissions, but importantly, too, the policy levers to get there. I mean, I could announce, wonderful targets for 2030, but unless we've outlined policies underneath it to get there, it's going to be pretty meaningless. So we need to be doing the roadmap, the strong roadmap, and I am committed to providing that to the Australian people before the next election, as well as the policy levers which underpin that roadmap. And I do think that'll put pressure on the government, to your question.
Thank you. Well, I'll just got one more question and then we'll go to questions from the audience. But I kind of wanted to stay in the international kind of context, but look at Australia's domestic exports of fossil fuels. We're one of the top 3 exporters in the world. However, the majority of our gas and coal go to countries like Japan and South Korea that do have net zero targets, meaning eventually, obviously, that demand will decline. We've got the Australian Institute released research a couple of weeks ago showing that in New South Wales, there's something like 23 proposals for new coal mines. And we've seen some strong support for a moratorium on new approvals of coal mines in the Hunter. But I guess my question for you is, how can Australia seriously transition its economy and transition the communities that engage in that type of industry if we're still growing the problem?
Well, I mean, let's just tackle coal exports head on. Now, you're right, and I've been very clear about the fact 70% of our trading partners, including big recipients of our thermal coal, are committed to net zero. And one of the first things I did as Shadow Climate Change Minister is say, this is going to put pressure on coal-based communities, thermal but coal-based communities, and we need to be having that conversation with those communities now, regardless of what domestic policies Australia has. That is going to put pressure on those communities. Now, I know some people say, well, we should shut down all coal mines today. I am more than happy to, and coal exports, I'm more than happy to go into communities and talk to them about the challenges and opportunities of the future as we move to net zero. What I'm not happy to do is go in and say, we're going to cut your exports. And by the way, that's not going to reduce emissions by one jot, because they're just going to be replaced by coal mines from elsewhere around the world. So you're going to give up your job or no reductions in emissions because those coal-fired power stations elsewhere around the world are going to continue. They're just going to get their coal elsewhere. I'm not prepared to do that. That's not a sustainable way of bringing the Australian people, including in regional communities, with you. What we are prepared to do is very much say that Australia will transition its energy generation to renewable, and we can become an export powerhouse of renewable energy, those same communities, as the rest of the world transitions away from coal, as Japan, Korea, China reach their net zero emissions targets. And as they change their energy generation, we can play a part of that by exporting through hydrogen. I mentioned in my opening remarks the Sun Cable, the Asian Renewable Energy Hub in Broome, or in the Pilbara, I should say. These are great. These are just two examples of the energy export opportunities for Australia, but two examples which come from areas which have traditionally been involved in energy generation in Australia, and those opportunities can apply to Queensland, to the Hunter Valley, to the Illawarra, to the Pilbara, going forward as well. So what we need to do is transition our exports to a more renewable focus as the rest of the world moves to net zero, and we need to be upfront with communities about that.
Thanks. I'll go to questions from the audience now. And I think following on from a couple of issues that you've talked on, the first question is from Howard Witt. He says, how will Labor react if our major trading partners introduce a carbon price or tariffs or a border adjustment levy on those who don't have such a price?
Well, we'll point out that this is a result of Australian government inaction, that our exporters are being subject to this. I mean, what the opposition says in Australia about that sort of thing is unlikely to sway the European Union or anyone else. It'll be a question that Australia has to deal with, and Australia has to deal with because of almost a decade of policy inaction, if that's what eventuates.
The next question is from Tom Swan. He asks, President Biden has made an executive order banning fossil fuel subsidies. Will Mr. Bowen consider a similar policy?
Well, again, our policy focuses on creating new renewable energy as our coal-fired power stations reach the end of their natural life. That, I think, is where the action is in relation to our energy generation, and then investing in those renewable energy opportunities in those regional areas. That is where my policy focus is. I think that is the Australian contribution, and we can make a very, very strong contribution that way.
The next question is from Tony Walker, and I think follows on a bit from that. So, Chris, you're talking about targeting regions for clean energy investment. He says there are plenty of sophisticated just transition and climate action groups working in regions towards the type of fundamental change we need to see. Do you see a way a Labor government could recognise and provide support to the work those groups are doing on the ground, so that change isn't just imposed from the top, but happens democratically with participation from the community?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm a big supporter of those efforts. The Hunter Jobs Alliance, I think, was really the first one to be framed in that way. And I hosted a forum in Canberra a couple of weeks ago where Labor Party caucus members could come and hear from the Hunter Jobs Alliance the work that they're doing. And it was very well attended, including by the leader, Anthony Albanese, to hear that work. And that's a good opportunity to support that work. And I know that model is being applied across the country. I know that there's one starting in Geelong, for example. So I do think that work is very important and deserves the support of federal parliament. It's got my support, and I engage with those groups as I go around the country. We are also committed to ensuring government infrastructure and there were things in our platform about this, government infrastructure supplies that support as to communities, to regional communities, as we are undertaking this change. And we'll have more policy detail to underpin that before the next election. But I also agree with the questioner that bottom up is important in these things. It can't just all be imposed from Canberra. Regional communities know themselves better than Canberra many of the opportunities and what needs to be done to realise them. So I agree with your questioner.
Thank you. You've already touched on this a little bit, but maybe a little bit more detail here. Diana Glynn asks, will the Labor Party use the National Reconstruction Fund to establish an electric vehicle production industry in Australia?
Well, I think that's got a lot of potential, whether it is electric vehicles in total or components of electric vehicles or batteries. It has potential, and the idea of the fund is to co-invest with the private sector. So we need private sector proposals to say we think this can work, but we need some government assistance, and that is exactly what that fund is targeted for. And renewable manufacturing, whether it be those things or the infrastructure that goes with wind generation, wind energy generation, turbines, or other things. I think there's great potential there. And so, yes, that is what that fund is designed for. We've also identified some other key strategic areas around health technology, etc. But renewable energy manufacturing is right up there. And to make this work, to be able to say to regional communities, there's opportunity in manufacturing can't just be rhetoric. There's got to be substance to underpin that. And the Jobs Fund, the manufacturing fund that we've announced, is part of that substance. Yes.
Richie, I might just come to you to follow up on that. I know the Australia Institute Centre for Future Work has done quite a lot of work, for example, around our lithium deposits and the fact that we don't really value add much to that, and that there is huge capacity in Australia to get into, refining lithium, producing batteries, and down the line producing electric vehicles. Do you want to just tell us a little bit more about some of that research?
Sure. The simple point is, if you want to help the manufacturing industry, you can support directly the manufacturing industry rather than pretending like funding gas companies to bring down the gas price in the hope that manufacturers will use the savings to then increase their manufacturing lines. Doesn't stack up, especially when our research shows that the majority of manufacturers do not consider gas to be a major component of their cost stack. So our research shows that if you can actually invest directly in the industries that are going to be part of the clean energy revolution, then you can get a much bigger bang for your buck, both in terms of job creation and in terms of economic benefit. A number of state governments are already moving into this. The WA government has a whole Lithium Valley strategy about how to vertically integrate its lithium mining with manufacturing. It's not just limited to lithium as well. There are a number of rare earths that Australia is rich in that it mines and exports as well. And also there's an obvious demand for it. I think Tesla gets the majority of its lithium from Australia, but there's no manufacturing here. If we want an EV strategy and we want a manufacturing strategy, then let's merge them together and see what we can do to build on that here. And the final point to make is that the other thing is to remove any impediments. And so it should be noted that something like the Victorian electric vehicle tax won't just diminish the uptake of electric vehicles, it'll also diminish the appetite from companies to set up shop in Victoria to actually look at bringing back any car manufacturing in parts there as well. So it's kind of, when you look at it at large, there are a number of things that we can do, both to increase opportunities, but also to get rid of impediments.
I've got a follow-up question from the audience on that. For you, Chris, it's from Ewan Black from the New Daily. He wanted to ask about those road user charges in Victoria, which we've already touched on. Says that they've been described as a major disincentive to electric vehicle ownership, with Australia's largest employer group saying it put the cart before the horse, and others saying it would slam the brakes on the transition to EVs. So would an Albanese government ask the Victorian government to reverse or cancel those charges as part of a broader holistic approach to replacing the declining fuel excise revenue?
Oh, I think if we're in office, we'd certainly have a conversation with premiers and state treasurers and climate change ministers about handling EVs going forward and incentivising EV take-up. As I said, I do understand the pressures that state treasuries are looking at in terms of road user charging more broadly, and I do think it's a national debate and conversation that's going to have to be had. it would be better if the federal government was engaged in that conversation with the states about how you would better coordinate. We do need to get a rapid take-up of EVs across the country. Now, if the Treasurer of Victoria was here, he would say to you, I would think, that road user charging will be less onerous on electric vehicles than it is on internal combustion engines per kilometre. It's still going to be better off compared to internal combustion engine in terms of what you pay in petrol tax as opposed to what you'd pay in a per kilometre EV charge. But my job as the climate change shadow is to get federal policy incentivising electric vehicle take-up. We've already started that, and there's a lot more to do.
The next question is from Graham McClay, and this might be a quick one. He says, where does Labor stand on Zali Steggall's climate bill?
Well, Zali Steggall's climate bill is fine. It's a bill which is a good step forward, but it will never come to a vote in Parliament. The way the Parliament works is the government decides what we vote on. And so I've met with Zali. I've discussed it with her. It's not exactly as I would have written it. It's not doesn't reflect Labor policy in every element, but it's certainly a lot of commonality there, a lot of common ground between our two approaches, and there'll be more common ground perhaps as I announce more policy. But I sometimes get asked, why doesn't Labor vote for Zali Steggall's bill? And I say, well, because we never get the opportunity. It won't come on for a vote before the next election. The Labor Party, if we form the next government, will have legislation. We'll legislate a net zero by 2050 target, for example. There'll be legislation underpinning not only what I've announced already, but underpinning everything else that we will announce that needs legislation to be done. So there'll be plenty of legislation under a Labor government. Unfortunately, Zali's bill will just never come on for discussion on the House of Representatives floor. Zali knows that. That's not a criticism of Zali at all. It's simply a statement of fact that the government won't allow it to come on for a vote.
I might jump in on Zali's bill just with a quick follow-up. One of the things that Zali's bill has is basically the construction of a new climate commission to provide that independent advice that would have a lot more weight and require a response from government in terms of setting targets, starting with net zero by 2050, but providing interim budgets that have had a major impact on how the UK has addressed its emissions and would hopefully do the same here. But that independent commission would be basically filled with experts that would be appointed by a panel. And what that would do is it would stop, I guess, some of the appointments that we're currently seeing now in some of the bodies that the federal government has. And most recently, last week, it was appointing Grant King to head up the Climate Change Authority as the chair. Grant King, who, when the Business Council of Australia had Grant King as chair, it said that Labor's target of 45% by 2030 was economy wrecking, and has obviously taken a number of positions that haven't helped our climate policies. Is there some merit, though, to at least looking at the idea of an independent commission to actually provide that kind of advice around targets?
Yeah, look, clearly, the government's attempted to abolish the Climate Change Authority on multiple occasions entirely, as you know, and having failed to do that, they decided to emasculate it instead. It has 9 staff. I'm not sure how many staff are at the Australia Institute, but you do a great job. You imagine what the Climate Authority could do with more than 9 staff, actually a seriously resourced authority giving that independent advice to government. So again, I'll have more to say about the architecture of government, but the principle that the authority should be properly resourced and truly independent is one that I strongly agree with.
We've probably only got time for 1 or 2 more questions. The next one is from Terry Sweetser. He says, Chris, do you see current government climate policy as an opportunity for China to exercise more influence in the Pacific? And will Australia become a pariah in Oceania as a result of current Morrison government policy?
Well, I do think our lack of action on climate is a problem for us in the Pacific. And the Pacific nations, Pacific islands, understand the ramifications of climate change probably better than anybody else in the world because they are looking at it every single day. And I think back to Peter Dutton's offensive comments about the Pacific islands and the water lapping on their doorsteps and the lack of empathy that showed for our brothers and sisters in the Pacific. So does it impact on our soft power in the Pacific, our lack of domestic seriousness when it comes to climate change policy? Absolutely it does. Does that have geopolitical ramifications for our soft power in the Pacific? Yes.
The next question that I've got here is from Anne, who talks about decades ago, France managing a transition from many coal mines to nuclear. And while nuclear is not on the cards in Australia, she asks, surely Australia can manage a transition to renewables more inclusively. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more, perhaps about some of the state government initiatives about renewables and how Labor will back more clean energy coming in as soon as possible.
Yeah, well, I think Anne's pretty right there. Yes, we can do that transition more inclusively, but really my point is that it can't just be a footnote. Sort of saying we're going to have climate change policy, and by the way, we'll get to regional jobs and we'll look after you at some point in the future. We'll retrain you. Doesn't cut it. Jobs and jobs growth in regional Australia has to be at the heart of renewable energy policy and climate change policy, and it can be. It must be. It has to be. So it's really what I'm talking about is an economic policy, a jobs creation policy, which deals with climate change, and reassuring people that they are at the centre of it. And as your question before indicated, there's some bottom-up initiatives that can help there. In terms of the state governments, I point to a couple of things. I point to Victoria's investment in the Latrobe Valley. Remember when Hazelwood closed and there was, shock and horror, and it was going to be terrible for energy generation and for that regional economy? Well, the Andrews Labor government stepped up, and unemployment in the Latrobe Valley today is lower than it was when Hazelwood was operating. So proper investments, properly targeted regional approaches can and do work. And then you've got governments state governments engaging in renewable energy zones focused on regional Australia. And to be fair, not just Labor governments. The Liberal government in New South Wales has a strong policy in that regard. Renewable energy zones focused on regional Australia or regional New South Wales, which again are making a difference and really making sure that people are clear about their role in a renewable energy future. So there are real policy levers that can and must be pulled. And at the moment, the states are doing all the heavy lifting. There's absolutely no federal involvement in the discussion about the future of regions in a renewable economy. There's no leadership from Canberra. And with all due respect to the good work the states are doing, Labor and Liberal, they can only do so much. It needs that federal leadership as well.
I'm not sure if we'll have time for another question after this, so this might be the last one, but it's from Lars Bendel, who says, how do we reach net zero or net negative emissions without a plan to deal with agriculture? And then I just might add to that and ask about, other sectors. Obviously, they all have to work together to reduce emissions.
Well, the answer to Lars is you don't. You don't get to net zero without a plan for agriculture. So it was a bit of I thought, a false debate a few months ago, or a bit more than a month ago, about whether net zero would apply to agriculture. Well, net zero must be an economy-wide ambition. It must be an economy-wide target. Otherwise, it's meaningless. But perhaps more importantly, agriculture has to be included in the policy levers to get there. And not only do I think that, the National Farmers Federation thinks that, and basically every farmer I've ever spoken to thinks that too, because they get it. They see the opportunities. Now, really it comes down to providing support to farmers as they transition their operations to be more emissions sensitive, less emissions intensive, and to assist them in storing carbon in their soils, for example. Now, that takes research and development. It takes investment in science. It takes investment in plans to convert that science into practical plans for farmers. And again, I'm looking at all those sorts of options, but you need that sectoral approach. So to your question, yes, we need a sectoral approach. We've started on that road in the Labor Party in the transport sector. We started on that road in the electricity sector, which is a little different because households are making the change themselves. As you know, we are the world's leader on rooftop solar, but that takes management, including managing the grid, and hence our community batteries proposal to help manage that. Then you've got industry, agriculture, which are important parts of those sectors as well, and they need to be part of it, and you need appropriate policies for them as well.
And just quickly, I've got two questions that I think are related, and if you could answer these briefly, Chris. One is from Michael McKeever, who says, do you see any difference in the coming election in comparison to how climate was addressed in previous elections? and also one about Labor's policy. Is it in alignment with Matt Keane's recent announcements in New South Wales? And do you have hope for some bipartisanship on climate policy in that respect?
Yeah, both good questions. So to Michael, I think you'll see a much stronger emphasis from the Labor Party on the economic opportunities of climate change. I refuse to accept this false trade-off that the Conservatives peddle at every election, that somehow ambitious action on climate change comes at a cost to the economy. Now, we don't win that argument during an election campaign. We've got to win that argument now and every day between the election, including the election campaign. But we've got to win the argument that this is a massive opportunity for Australia. The risks of not acting economically are extraordinary. The opportunities of acting are very, very strong. And let's win this argument. Remember that ridiculous argument that Scott Morrison put last time about the cost of action on climate change when he's presiding over massive missed opportunities for regional economies. So really, I think that is the big change in terms of the approach that we take. It's core economic policy that I intend to prosecute in election campaign. Strong action on climate change. In relation to Matt Keane, yes, the policy of the New South Wales government is a good one. It was supported in a bipartisan fashion at the state level, and I have absolutely no qualms in saying I support good climate change policy at the state level, regardless of what side proposes it. I see it around the country, including in New South Wales.
Well, we might have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much for joining us today, Chris Bowen, and thanks for persevering through all those technological issues.
We got there in the end. I know it's a little bit bumpy to start with, but we got there, and that's the main thing. It was a good conversation. So thanks for persevering with us as well.
Thanks to Richie Merzian, and thank you all of you for joining us today. This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel, which you can find at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you for listening to Follow the Money, and have a great summer.